My name is Yousef, and I'm only here today because God intervened in ways I never could have imagined. What I'm about to share with you isn't just a story. It's the journey that changed everything I thought about life, faith, and redemption. It all started on the worst day of my life. An explosion took my parents from me and my brother Ahmad. In an instant, we became orphans. Not only were we alone in the world, but we were also rejected by it. Our own community turned its back on us. We were two Muslim children wandering the streets, sleeping in rubble, begging for scraps, and trying not to freeze to death. It was on one of those freezing nights, huddled in an alley, that a Christian family found us. They could have passed by, as everyone else did, but they stopped. They gave us food, shelter, and most surprisingly, affection. For the first time since our parents' death, someone treated us like human beings. But unfortunately, that act of love came at a cost. From that moment on, our own people began to see us as traitors. We were on the wrong side, living with infidels. We no longer belonged anywhere. Ahmad felt this burden more than I did. Over time, anger took over. He rebelled against everything. The West, Christians, the hypocrisy he saw all around us. He began attending secret meetings, engaging with extreme ideas, and reading things that made me afraid just to look at. When he spoke, there was fire in his eyes, a mixture of pain, passion, and hatred. Little by little, I lost the brother I knew, until one day the worst happened. ISIS took him. They were already watching him. The words he spoke, the ideas he shared, all of it drew attention. That morning, I heard the shouting from afar. I ran as fast as I could, but when I arrived, Ahmad had already disappeared. Masked men dragged him away like an animal. They left behind only silence and terror. And I knew he would be executed. That no one, not the government, not the army, would do anything. My brother, who had always protected me, was now completely vulnerable. It was there that I made the hardest decision of my life. If I couldn't save him from the outside, I would try to do it from the inside. Yes, I would infiltrate the very group that had captured him. I would have to don the mask of the enemy to try to free the one I loved most. The next morning, I went to an ISIS recruitment center. I concocted a story full of lies. I said I hated the West, that I wanted to fight for their cause. I was nervous but convinced, and incredibly they believed me. Within days, I was already part of the organization. I trained with them, ate with them, listened to their speeches, but everything about me was an act. Every step was calculated. I needed to look like one of them, but without losing what still made me human. All I wanted was to find Ahmad before it was too late. It took weeks before I finally discovered where he was being held. It was a remote compound reserved for executions, and his execution was already scheduled the following week. At that moment, time began to fly by. Thanks to the trust I had earned, I was placed on the security team on the day of the execution. It was there, among the other fighters, that I saw Ahmad again. He was unrecognizable, thin, wounded, but there was still life in his eyes. When our eyes met, time stood still. At first, he seemed confused. Then he recognized me. And then came the look that hurt me the most, disappointment. He thought I'd sold out, that I was truly part of it all. And there, even without words, I promised that I would not let him die. In that moment, when I saw my brother forced to his knees in the sand, everything inside me screamed. He looked at the ground, perhaps accepting the end. And I, standing there, pretending to be one of them, struggled to remain calm while inside everything was falling apart. Ahmad thought I'd sold out, that I was now part of what he was fighting against. Seeing that look of disappointment on his face hurt more than any threat. But there was no time for explanations. They tied his hands, positioned him before the crowd, and the executioner raised the blade. It was at that moment that everything stopped. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear the screams around me. I knew either I acted now or I would lose my brother forever. I was prepared to die there if necessary. But then, something happened. Something I hadn't planned. Something only God could have orchestrated. A commotion erupted on the other side of the field. A loud sound, an explosion. I'm not sure what it was. I only know that everyone turned, including the executioner. The confusion was enough. I ran to Ahmad, pushed the man next to him, and shouted for him to get up. I grabbed his arm and we ran without looking back. Gunfire erupted, but they didn't know who to shoot. In the chaos, no one knew who was friend or foe. We managed to escape by a miracle. A true miracle. I knew deep down that God had opened that rift in time. It was as if heaven had shouted, "Now!" In the days that followed, while we were in hiding, I had the chance to tell him everything. I told Ahmad what I had done, why I had infiltrated ISIS, and how every day in that place was torture inside. He listened silently, and for the first time in a long time, I saw tears in his eyes. He realized I had never betrayed him. I had fought for him. But to understand how we got to that point, we need to go back a little. Ahmad had changed a lot over the years. By the time he turned 22, he was practically a stranger to me. That older brother who used to protect me in days of hunger and cold now spent his days immersed in fiery speeches. He would spend hours in a remote mosque where a group gathered to talk about a new Islamic order. But it wasn't faith they were fostering there. It was hatred. They spoke of jihad, of armed struggle, of purifying religion by force. It was all very different from the faith our parents had taught us. Ahmad returned from these meetings transformed, his eyes shining, repeating phrases about honor and resistance. But there was something dark behind every word. Over time, he began to attract attention. He stood on platforms, spoke to crowds, and set the hearts of young people like us ablaze with his words. He said the Muslim world had been humiliated and that it was time to react. He criticized moderate religious leaders, calling them cowards. His words were powerful, yes, but also dangerous. What Ahmad didn't realize was that he was messing with forces much larger and more ruthless than he imagined. ISIS, already operating in the shadows of our region, sensed his influence. They disliked competition, much less anyone who spoke out against their methods. While he spoke of courageous resistance, they marked him as a target. To them, Ahmad was a threat, someone with charisma, with vision, with the audacity to say no to their tyranny. And that was unacceptable. Little by little, the signs began to appear. Friends who had previously followed him began to distance themselves. Some were afraid of being associated with him. Even members of the mosque began to avoid him. But Ahmad didn't see it. He was so focused on his mission that he ignored the risk. He believed he was doing the right thing, even if it meant walking straight into a trap. And that's exactly what happened. Even the Imam, who had initially encouraged Ahmad's fervor, began to back off. He began advising moderation, balance, less fire, and more wisdom. But Ahmad wouldn't listen. When I tried to warn him, begging him to tone it down, to protect himself, to remember that we were still young and vulnerable, without family, without powerful alliances, he looked at me as if I had betrayed everything we were. He said I had sold out, that the kindness of the Christian family who had taken us in had weakened me, that I had abandoned our faith in exchange for comfort. To him, my concern was cowardice. He thought I had forgotten what happened to our parents, and worse, that I was trying to forget who we were. Our conversations began to turn into arguments. He returned from meetings even angrier, speaking of sacrifice, of martyrdom, of standing up to tyrants even if it cost him his life. I, on the other side, tried to hold on to any piece of him that still reminded me of the brother who protected me when we were just boys alone in the world. But it was no use. Ahmad had become a symbol, and he was convinced that this was his calling. He was no longer the boy who shared a blanket with me on cold nights. Now he was a leader. Young people surrounded him, listened attentively, and echoed his words. To them, Ahmad was a strong voice, someone who spoke boldly what many only whispered in secret. For the first time, he felt seen, important. After years of being invisible, everyone now looked at him with respect, even reverence. On the eve of what would become his capture, he organized a massive rally. The square was packed. Ahmad took the makeshift stage and spoke with a fiery, chilling intensity. He denounced the extremists' distorted use of faith, openly condemning ISIS, calling them wolves in sheep's clothing, men who claimed to serve God but in reality only sought power. He spoke of protecting the innocent, of the true essence of jihad, which was not violence but justice. The crowd cheered. Shouts of support echoed through the streets, but amid the applause, cold eyes watched. Informers paid by ISIS itself were there, in the crowd, taking notes, recording, marking every word. Ahmad's speech, his courage, his influence, all of this put him squarely in their crosshairs. They don't attack immediately. They wait for the moment when no one is looking. And that's exactly what they did. It was early when it happened. I was leaving home for the grocery store as usual. I was crossing the street when I heard the sounds. Tires screeching, truck doors slamming, screams. So much confusion. My feet started running before my mind even grasped what was happening. I arrived and saw it all. Ahmad being dragged away by armed, hooded men with rifles drawn. His face was bruised, his mouth bleeding. He tried to resist as he always did, but there were too many of them. They tied his hands and forced him into one of the vehicles. They didn't say a word. They didn't offer any explanation. They simply drove away, leaving behind a silent warning that they were not to be trifled with. I followed, running, screaming, begging. I offered my life in exchange for his, but the engines had already roared down the street, and I stood there still, with the taste of dust in my mouth, my chest burning with despair, and my eyes fixed on the void where they had taken him. I knew who we were dealing with. I knew what they were capable of. And I knew that if something wasn't done, I would lose Ahmad forever. After Ahmad was taken, the neighbors who witnessed the kidnapping hardly dared to look at me. There was fear in every look, in every door that closed before I could knock. Silence spoke louder than any words. Everyone knew what had happened, and everyone knew what could happen to anyone who tried to get involved. ISIS left no doubt. They didn't forgive, they didn't forget, and they never let an act of defiance go unpunished. The mere thought of helping someone they'd marked was in itself a death sentence. People offered me looks of compassion, timid gestures, a few whispered prayers, but no one was willing to risk themselves for Ahmad, not even for me. I went to the police. I told them everything, asked for help, pleaded, but the officers just looked away. They said they didn't have the resources, that their superiors wouldn't allow direct confrontation. In other words, they were scared and wouldn't mess with ISIS because of a young idealist. I went to the mosque. The same imam who had once inspired Ahmad now merely repeated cliches, encouraging prayer and patience. Patience? My brother was in the hands of murderers, and he was talking to me about patience. Everything in me screamed for action, for justice, for a miracle. I knocked on local government doors. At each one, the response was the same. Shrugged shoulders, empty apologies, expressions of helplessness. No promises, no hope. Just the clear and brutal message. There's nothing that can be done. But I couldn't accept it. How could I just let Ahmad die? He was the only one I had left. My brother, my protector, my best friend. He was the one who cared for me when no one else cared. He was the one who shared the last piece of bread, who tucked me in on cold nights, who stood up to the bullies for me. He saved me so many times. How could I abandon him now? It was in this void of options, in this cruel silence, that the answer came. Not because it was safe or logical, but because it was the only one. If no one dared face them, then I would. If no one dared get close enough, I would. And there was only one way. I would have to go among them, infiltrate hell to try to rescue my brother. The idea was so absurd that I felt sick just thinking about it. Me becoming what I hated most, pretending to serve a cause that destroyed lives, communities, families, all in the name of power disguised as faith. But I knew Ahmad. I knew that if he were in my shoes, he would do the same. And perhaps he had even taught me unknowingly that sometimes we have to throw ourselves into the fire for the ones we love. That was my cross. That was my war. That night I didn't sleep. I mentally wrote the character I needed to be. A radicalized young man revolted by Western influence, willing to die for the purity of Islam. I crafted a compelling story, full of details, pain, and hatred, because that's what they were looking for. They couldn't see their brother in despair. They needed to see a faithful soldier, a believer, willing to kill. The next morning, I walked to the old school building that now served as a recruitment center. What had once been a place of learning was now a temple of terror. The walls were covered with black flags, angry slogans painted on them, and pictures of martyrs with burning eyes. Young men came and went as if they were going to a game or a festival. Some were excited, others silent, all mesmerized by the promise of glory. When my turn came, I was led to one of the officers in charge of recruitment. I remember every detail of that moment. The smell of the room, the dim light, the coldness in his gaze. He said that Ahmad's capture had been my awakening, that I realized how futile the watered-down faith of moderate Muslims was, that only jihad could restore our honor. I spoke firmly with conviction, even as my heart trembled. I want to fight for the caliphate, I said. I want to be part of what God is doing here. He watched me for several long seconds. Then he nodded slowly. Let's see what you're made of. The officer in front of me was everything I expected, cold, meticulous, and suspicious. His eyes seemed to pierce my skin, trying to discern my true intentions. He took his time. He asked detailed questions about my religious upbringing, my connection with Ahmad, the time I spent living with the Christian family. He wanted to know why I, after all, was here asking to be part of something so radical. I had rehearsed every answer. I had created an entire character in my head, with consistent motivations, compelling wounds, and a story that made sense. But answering those questions with a firm voice, while my heart seemed to be breaking inside me, was one of the hardest things I've ever done. They didn't accept me right away, and that was to be expected. For several days I was kept under observation, a sort of trial period, as if to test whether my faith was real or fake. They put me to work with other new recruits, doing simple tasks, cleaning weapons, organizing stocks, preparing training spaces. But every gesture was scrutinized. Every word I said seemed to weigh a ton. The other newcomers were a cruel reflection of the reality that surrounded us. There was everything there. Young people with true faith, ready to die for what they believed in. Others simply hungry for power, for respect, for any form of identity that would give them some value in this world. And of course, there were also those who hid something behind their eyes, like me. The brainwashing started from day one. They knew exactly what they were doing. They cut us off from all outside contact. No family, no friends, no memories of who we were. They wanted to erase everything and rewrite us from scratch. Endless sermons about the nobility of the cause, the impurity of the enemy, the eternal glory of the martyr. Sermons that mixed faith with hatred, justice with revenge, courage with cruelty. They showed videos, lots of videos, of executions, of attacks, of their victories. They shouted powerful phrases, manipulating our fears, our pain, our longing. They said that showing compassion was weakness, that hesitating in the face of an order was treason, that the greatest act of faith would be to die, but by killing first. Everything inside me was revolting, but on the outside, I couldn't show it. I smiled at the right moments. I agreed with their absurdities. I pretended to be moved by their words. I applauded videos that made me nauseous. It was like living in a play where, if I messed up a single line, the entire stage would collapse on me. The physical training was as brutal as the psychological. They wanted to turn us into machines, fast, lethal, obedient. We learned to handle weapons, build explosives, and identify civilian targets. They taught us how to infiltrate, how to make the greatest impact possible. They wanted efficient killers, immune to doubt, impervious to regret. And the worst part? It worked. I saw with my own eyes good boys become monsters. I saw once frightened eyes turn cold. I saw gentle smiles fade, giving way to anger. They broke every piece of people's souls and reassembled them as they pleased. With each passing day, my disguise grew heavier. I slept fearing I'd said too much. I woke up reminding myself of who I was, so I wouldn't lose myself completely in what I was pretending to be. But there was one reason, only one, that kept me going. Ahmad. I would endure hell if it would get me there. But I had something no one else there had. A mission that had nothing to do with what they preached. I wasn't looking for a purpose in life. I didn't want to belong to any of it. My only goal was to find Ahmad, to save my brother. And that clarity protected me. While others sought meaning or status, I kept my eyes fixed on something real. This gave me the strength to resist the brainwashing, even as I pretended to be transformed by it. I smiled at the right times, nodded during the sermons, and even repeated some of the phrases everyone there memorized. But inside, my heart was unmoved. I did what was necessary to move up. I volunteered for every assignment. I took the toughest missions, the most thankless schedules, the riskiest jobs. I wanted, and needed, to be where the secrets lay. The more I cooperated, the more they trusted me. I began moving into previously restricted areas, listening in on previously confidential conversations. And discreetly, I began gathering clues. I wanted to understand how their prisons worked, where they took the captured, how they decided who lived and who died. Every bit of information was a piece of the puzzle that could lead me to Ahmad. But it wasn't easy. Nothing there was. And the closer I got to the truth, the further I got from myself. Sometimes the price was almost unbearable. I witnessed things that haunt me to this day. I saw horrors no soul should ever witness. I was forced to remain silent in the face of the pain of innocence. I was present at scenes of brutal violence, where every second seemed to scream against everything I believed in. Sometimes I found myself locked in the bathroom, washing my face until my fingers went numb, as if I could wash away the blood that wasn't mine, but which I felt clinging to my skin. But I kept going, because I needed to keep going. My false devotion began to bear fruit. They began to treat me as one of their own. Trust came, along with more responsibility and access. And finally, I began to hear the prisoners' names, conversations between guards, orders relayed over the radio. I began to build a mental map of the detention facilities. It was a slow, risky process. Any slip-up, any misplaced word, and it would be the end. But I couldn't stop. Ahmad was out there, perhaps just a few feet away from me, and time was against us. ISIS didn't keep prisoners alive for long. They used executions as spectacle, as a warning. They killed to remind them who was in charge. And Ahmad, with everything he'd said publicly against them, with all the reach his voice had gained, he was exactly the kind of prisoner they loved to make an example of. My mind was constantly in conflict. Every day was an internal battle. I had to remind myself who I was. I had to mentally remind myself that this was a mission, that I was still the brother Ahmad knew. But sometimes, I even began to doubt myself. I feared I was losing myself in the role. I was beginning to forget what my true voice sounded like. But then I remembered him, Ahmad's face, the way he smiled when he shared a piece of bread with me, his protective gaze when things got tough. I clung to those memories like a castaway clings to a piece of driftwood. That was what kept me human. Finally, after weeks of living this double life, the truth came out. I discovered where the most important prisoners were kept. It was a secluded walled compound, surrounded by watchtowers. It wasn't an ordinary place, it was where those marked for death were kept. The examples, those whose deaths would be watched by dozens, sometimes hundreds of people. Public executions, staged as if they were plays. When I saw my name listed among those assigned to the security team for the next execution, my heart sank. This was it, my chance, my gateway to that place. From then on, every minute counted. I knew Ahmad might be among the condemned, and if he was, this might be my last chance to reach him before it was too late. The place where everything would happen was outside the city, a clearing surrounded by rammed earth walls, like an amphitheater carved into the landscape. It wasn't just an execution site, it was a precisely constructed stage of terror, where ISIS flexed its muscles to keep everyone under control. Hundreds of people were forcibly brought there, in trucks and buses, forced to watch the brutality as a form of education. It was a spectacle of fear. There was everything in that crowd. Parents holding their children, women with their faces covered, young people with empty eyes. Most just wanted to survive. Some wept silently. Others just stared at the ground, trying to disconnect from reality. But no one could leave. They were all trapped in that arena, watching neighbors and friends being killed as a warning. My task was to patrol the perimeter. I was armed, positioned where I had a good view of the crowd and surrounding activity. My presence there was to ensure no one disrupted the event, and if necessary to use lethal force. I was, in their eyes, part of the machine, one of the people who made the system work. Then the prisoners began to arrive. They came in groups, hands tied behind their backs, some limping, others barely able to stand. Their faces told stories that words couldn't convey. I saw men with dull eyes, women with dignity, even in the midst of suffering, young women trembling with fear. Many were injured, others completely in shock, but they all knew they wouldn't make it out alive. As each new group approached, I searched desperately for my brother's face. Part of me hoped he wasn't among them. The other part feared that if he didn't appear soon, I might never get a chance to get close again. And then, there he was, Ahmad, thinner, more haggard, his face scarred from weeks of imprisonment, but with that same sparkle in his eyes, the same determined look he'd had since he was little, when he'd defended me on the streets and told me everything would be okay. He walked with difficulty, but with his head held high. Even there, walking toward his death, there was still strength in his posture. But when our eyes met, everything changed. The moment he recognized me there, next to the ISIS men, dressed like them, armed like them, his face changed. First came confusion, then recognition, and then disappointment, a heartbreaking one. He thought I had surrendered, that I had betrayed everything he had fought for, that I was one of them. That destroyed me inside. My instinct was to run to him, tell him the truth, shout that I was there for him for everything we'd been through together. But I couldn't. One unexpected gesture, one wrong word, and the other guards would suspect. If anyone understood what was really happening, not only would I die, Ahmad would too, and perhaps worse, in front of everyone as an example. So I stood still, watching, doing nothing as my brother was pushed forward, kneeling in the sand alongside other condemned men. The executioner was already ready. A hooded man holding a long blade, his eyes dry and accustomed. This was nothing new to him. He'd done this before, many times. To him, it was just another morning of justice. And I knew this was the moment. Either I would do something now, or I would lose Ahmad forever. He moved with the coolness of someone who has learned to kill without hesitation, without feeling anything. The crowd, forced into silence, watched in terror as the executioner advanced on the first prisoner. This man was accused of spying for the government, of providing information that led to the arrest of ISIS fighters. The execution was swift, brutal, designed to highlight the price of defying the group. I watched each prisoner before Ahmad, as the executioner moved with almost mechanical precision. With each instant, the distance between my brother and death diminished. My brain calculated angles, distances, timing, trying to figure out if there was any chance to act before it was too late for both of us. As the blade descended on the third young man in line, a boy who looked not much older than me, I realized I had about 30 seconds before Ahmad's turn. 30 seconds to decide whether I would reveal my true identity and face death on the spot, or stand by helplessly watching his execution. Ahmad stared at me. There was no fear or pleading. He accepted his fate with the same courage he always had, the strength he used to shield me from the world as children. The executioner was already behind him, raising his blade for the final blow. This was the moment I dreaded and waited for every day since I entered that prison. The moment to choose between maintaining my cover or saving my brother. My heart screamed at me to act, even though I knew it could mean my death. I wanted to die trying, so I wouldn't have to carry the burden of having done nothing. But before I could move, before the executioner could act, something unexpected happened. A sound coming from the sky. At first distant, but growing louder until it was impossible to ignore. Everyone looked up at the same time, trying to understand where it was coming from. A formation of military helicopters appeared on the horizon, flying low and fast straight towards us. ISIS commanders began shouting orders, trying to organize themselves for the coming attack. The guards abandoned their posts, rushing to prepare for battle. The meticulously planned execution was beginning to unravel into chaos, but it wasn't a government force coming to save prisoners. They were rival groups, enemies of ISIS, who chose that moment to attack, fighting for control of that region. It had nothing to do with me, Ahmad, or a rescue. It was just a coincidence, a stroke of fate. It was just an opportunity that presented itself in the midst of that war, an unexpected moment when everything could change. The helicopter attack lasted minutes, but to me it felt like an eternity. Amidst the chaos, the gunfire, the explosions, the screams of the people, I managed to cut Ahmad's bonds and pull him to safety, behind a concrete wall. Together we fled in the confusion. Two brothers running through the desert with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the will to live. But survival came at a price I hadn't anticipated. In the days that followed, as we hid in borrowed homes, trying to make sense of what had happened, I began to feel the true weight of it all. What I had done, entering that dark world, living with its brutality, pretending to be one of them, had left deep scars my mind couldn't bear. The nightmares came fast. I would wake in the middle of the night screaming, reliving the executions, seeing the faces of the people I couldn't save. My hands shook uncontrollably, remembering the weight of the weapons I'd carried, the sharp sound of the blade, the bitter smell of blood on the ground. Sleeping became a torment, and when I was awake, I lived on high alert, always expecting the worst. Guilt crushed me. I had managed to save Ahmad, yes, but at what cost? I felt the weight of all those left behind, of the lives I'd lost sight of every cruel act I'd seen and been unable to prevent. Wearing their uniforms, wielding their weapons, pretending to believe in their cause, it ate away at my soul, as if their darkness had infiltrated me. Ahmad tried to comfort me, calling me a hero, telling me I'd risked everything for him. But I couldn't accept those words. I felt tainted, as if the shadow I'd carried had changed me forever. I began to question everything I did, trying to find another way out, torturing my mind with the idea that deep down I had become what I wanted to destroy. Shame was perhaps the hardest blow. I had lied to everyone, to ISIS, to Ahmad, to myself. I had pretended to be one of them, while inside I was crying out to save what was left of humanity. I no longer knew who I was after so much time pretending. The line between who I was and who I needed to be to survive blurred. And this began to weigh on the relationship with Ahmad. Even scarred, he came back stronger, with his faith intact and an unbroken spirit. He spoke of starting over, of using what we've experienced to help others who have suffered, of moving forward. I, however, was trapped, stuck in the past, reliving every moment of that infiltration, fighting every decision I made. While Ahmad clung to the hope of healing, I drowned in a sea of guilt and self-judgment. He tried to draw me into conversations about the future, plans, rebuilding, but my mind was stuck in the past, mired in consuming memories. He wanted to celebrate our survival, but all I could feel was the pain of the losses we carried. Within me, a deep spiritual void was forming. I grew up Muslim, raised to trust in Allah's mercy and justice, but everything I experienced with ISIS had ruined that connection. I could no longer pray without remembering the prayers I recited while pretending to be one of them. I couldn't open the Quran without hearing the twisted verses they used to justify such brutality. What had once been my refuge, my strength, was now a source of anguish. I felt forgotten by God, abandoned by the divinity I tried so hard to serve. If Allah were truly merciful, why did He allow ISIS to exist? If He were just, why did so many innocent people suffer while cruel men prospered? If He were all-powerful, why did He demand that I become what I despised to save my brother? My questions fell on deaf ears. My prayers seemed to fall into an unbearable silence. Anger began to consume me. Anger at ISIS for the cruelty I witnessed. Anger at the world for its indifference. Anger at God for its silence. But most of all, anger at myself, for my weakness, for my cowardice, for not having found another way to save Ahmad. Physically, I had survived, but spiritually, I felt like I was dying, hopeless, meaningless, aimless. Ahmad watched my downfall with growing anguish. He had saved me so many times when we were children, and now I was the one who needed saving. But he didn't know how to reach me, how to pull his brother out of the deep darkness I was sinking into. He felt helpless, and it broke my heart. The breaking point came 6 months after our escape. I was alone in a small apartment, far from everything we knew, staring at a bottle full of pills I'd begun to hoard. The pain was unbearable, the guilt overwhelming, the emptiness so deep I couldn't see a way out. I couldn't imagine a future where I could feel human again. Ahmad had gone to work, a construction job, trying to rebuild what we could. I should have been doing the same, but my body and mind wouldn't let me. I spent most of my days sitting in that apartment, trapped in the memories of ISIS, tormenting myself with everything I saw and did. As I held those pills, I realized I had reached the limit of what I could bear. I had already survived so much: the loss of our parents, the years of poverty and rejection, infiltration into that brutal organization, the psychological toll of living undercover. but what I couldn't overcome were the consequences of it all. Cruel irony. The success of my mission ended up being my undoing. I fell to my knees in that small room and did something I hadn't done in months. I cried out to God, not in anger, but in complete surrender. I admitted I was broken, that I didn't have the strength to fix myself, that I needed something bigger than myself. For the first time since we ran away, I didn't try to be strong, brave, or a hero. I was just honest about my utter helplessness. I can't take this anymore, I whispered to the silence that surrounded me. I don't know who I am. I don't know what I believe. I don't know how to live with what I've done. Please, if you're real, if you're listening, help me. I'm lost. The silence that followed wasn't the cold emptiness I knew. It was different. I didn't feel God's absence, but something I couldn't name. A deep peace that, even though it didn't make sense given everything I'd been through, began to invade me. As I knelt there, memories I had tried to bury came flooding back. I remembered the Christian family who welcomed us, the peace that seemed to envelop their home, the woman who became like a mother to us, how she prayed before meals, read the Bible at night, spoke of Jesus not as a distant figure, but as someone she knew personally. I remembered how they responded to the persecution of their community, not with anger or revenge, but with patience and forgiveness. When stones were thrown at their homes, they prayed for the attackers. When threatened, they responded with kindness. They lived a faith completely different from the violent religiosity of ISIS. While ISIS claimed to serve God through hatred, violence, and fear, this family served God with love, sacrifice, and peace. They risked everything to help 2 Muslim orphans. They opened their homes and hearts to us, treating us with a dignity I had never known before. I began to understand that even years ago, these seeds had been planted in my heart. In those months living with them, listening to their stories, their prayers, the woman who cared for us spoke about Jesus, about how he died for the sins of the world, about God's love being greater than any mistake or failure. Back then I listened politely, but I didn't understand. I was just a Muslim boy, grateful for their kindness but not interested in religion. Now, in the depths of my despair, these memories had new meaning. In that moment of surrender, something shifted inside me. The Jesus the family spoke of stopped being just a distant figure or ancient history. He began to feel real, someone present, someone alive. It was no longer just a distant idea. Jesus began to reveal himself to me as a living presence, someone who understood my pain and could offer true healing. I remembered the stories I'd been told about him, how much he suffered, the rejection he faced, the death he bore to take away the weight of the world's sins. For the first time, I realized that perhaps Jesus truly understood what I was experiencing. He was betrayed, surrounded by violence, saw innocents suffer, abandoned by friends, and rejected by his own people. More than that, he shouldered guilt and shame that weren't his. He took on the sins of us all. That's when I began to see a connection between his story and mine. I had infiltrated that dark world of ISIS, hiding my true self, just as Jesus lived among sinners, never losing his purity. I disguised myself as something evil to protect someone I loved, just as Jesus became sin to save humanity, but without sin of his own. The difference? He did it perfectly while I failed so many times. He remained pure while I felt corrupted. He saved everyone. I was only able to save my brother. He conquered death while I still struggled to find meaning in everything I'd experienced. But what touched me most was realizing that Jesus didn't judge me for my failures. On the contrary, he was willing to carry the guilt and shame that were destroying me. The Christian family that welcomed us talked a lot about forgiveness, about how Jesus died to take away our sins, how God's love overcomes any mistake we make. And in that moment, I understood that it wasn't just theory. It was a real invitation to healing. Jesus wasn't asking me to fix myself to be accepted. He wanted to carry my burdens, heal my wounds, restore who I had ceased to be. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a slow process of realizing that I was loved, despite everything, that my worth wasn't dependent on what I'd done, and that my identity wasn't tied to my mistakes. Jesus offered me a new identity. No longer an infiltrator, a man marked by fear and guilt, but a beloved child of God. I began to pray differently, not as someone desperate, but as someone trusting in a love greater than any suffering. I opened the Bible my family had given us years before and discovered a God different from the one I'd imagined, far more compassionate and loving than the harsh one I'd feared. The healing began slowly, like water penetrating dry land. The nightmares continued, but not with the same intensity. The guilt didn't disappear, but I learned to cope with it, accepting the forgiveness I had previously rejected. The shame didn't disappear, but it lost its power to define who I am, because I began to see my true worth in Christ. And little by little, my experience with ISIS took on new meaning. Instead of seeing it all as a stain on my soul, I began to understand that my journey was a testament to true love, a sacrifice made for the one I loved most. I was willing to lose myself to save my brother, just as Jesus gave himself up to save humanity. My mission was flawed, imperfect, but genuine. Telling Ahmad about this new faith blossoming within me was one of the most difficult conversations of my life. He had closely followed my struggle with the ghosts that remained after my escape, seeing how I was crumbling inside both mentally and spiritually. He worried about my mental health. And now I was going to tell him that I found hope in the faith of those who, despite being different, welcomed us as children. I waited for the right moment when Ahmad was calm, when he had time to truly listen. We were there in our small apartment sharing a simple meal when I finally found the courage. "Ahmad, I need to tell you something important," I began, feeling the weight of it. "I've been thinking a lot about everything we've been through, about why we're still here when so many aren't. I think I've found some answers." He looked at me, a mixture of hope and concern written on his face, that expression that was already familiar to me. "What kind of answers?" I took a deep breath and said, "I've been thinking about that Christian family who took us in. The love they had for us, the way they spoke of Jesus, the peace they carried even when they were persecuted. I think they were right. I think Jesus is real, and I think he saved us." A series of emotions flashed across Ahmad's face in the blink of an eye. Surprise, confusion, worry, and finally resistance. "Yousef, you're still trying to come to terms with all this," he said, his voice firm but careful. "You're trying to make sense of something that has no meaning. Just because some Christians were nice to us doesn't mean their religion is true." "It's not just that," I replied. "It's what I felt, Ahmad, when I was at my lowest. A presence, a peace, a love that I can't explain. And when I started reading about Jesus, things started to make sense." Ahmad stood up and began pacing the cramped room restlessly. "Are you talking about converting to Christianity? Do you understand what that means for us? We're already rejected, already seen as outsiders in our community. This could make us outcasts for good." "I know it's not easy," I replied, looking into his eyes. "But I can't ignore what I've experienced. Jesus isn't just a religious figure to me now. He's someone who understands suffering, who offers true healing, who died to save people like us." The conversation went on for hours, sometimes heated, sometimes tender, but always sincere. Ahmad was concerned about my mental health, fearing I was clinging to spiritual solutions to problems that were actually psychological. Furthermore, he was too practical to ignore the social and cultural consequences that converting to the Christian faith would bring to us in that community. But I learned from the patience of that Christian family who welcomed us, and I tried to be patient myself. I didn't force Ahmad to accept my faith immediately, nor did I engage in arguments. I simply shared what was happening to me, the peace I felt, the growing hope, the lessening of nightmares, the less overwhelming guilt, the sense of purpose that was beginning to emerge even amid the pain. In the weeks that followed, Ahmad began to notice changes that couldn't be explained by psychology alone. I was sleeping better, eating right, and starting to engage with life, something I hadn't done since we fled. He still carried the trauma, but this time with a hope I hadn't known before. Most importantly, I was becoming the brother he remembered from childhood, compassionate, caring, interested in caring for him, and not just consumed by my own pain. The love I was discovering in Jesus was beginning to overflow into our relationship, healing the wounds that time and suffering had left. Ahmad began asking me questions about this new faith, not because he was ready to believe, but because he wanted to understand what was happening to me. I shared Bible verses with him that gave me strength. I spoke of the prayers that had been answered, of the peace I felt during the service. The turning point was when Ahmad realized that this faith didn't distance me from him, but rather brought me closer. The Jesus I followed didn't require me to stop loving my brother. On the contrary, he taught me to love him in a deeper, truer way. "Maybe we should visit that Christian family again," Ahmad said one evening. "I want to thank them for what they did for us, and I want to better understand what they believe." It was the beginning of his journey, a path different from mine but equally transformative. Together we began to learn what it meant to be loved by God, to be forgiven for our mistakes, to find purpose in the pain we carried. Our experience with ISIS, which nearly destroyed us, became the foundation for understanding the power of grace, sacrifice, and redemption. We learned that true love often demands enormous sacrifices, that faith can survive even the darkest moments, and that God can transform even the worst stories into hope and healing. Two brothers, once orphaned and rejected, saved by an unexpected love, now followed Jesus, understanding the cost of faith and the power of self-giving love. Our story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. It's been 3 years since that day in the desert. Today, Ahmad and I live in a simple apartment in Germany, where we've been welcomed as refugees, far from the land we once called home, but with a future that's now full of hope. The journey to this point has never been easy. We spent months in refugee camps, facing seemingly endless bureaucracy. We've had to tell our stories countless times, always careful not to reveal too much about my time in ISIS. Germany has been generous to us, but life as refugees brings its own challenges. We're learning a new language, acclimating to different customs, trying to find our place in a society that sometimes views us with suspicion. Ahmad works in a factory during the day and studies German at night. I got a job with a Christian organization that helps refugees integrate here. Every day I see people arriving with the same frightened look I had when I arrived. Families torn apart by war, young people who have lost everything, children who have seen horrors no boy or girl should ever witness. They arrive carrying only trauma and a faint hope, searching for someone who can understand their pain. That's when I found my purpose. What once seemed like a deep stain on my soul, my past in ISIS, became a bridge to reach and help others. Today, I recognize the signs of radicalization. I can identify the vulnerabilities that extremist groups exploit, and I offer real hope to those who feel abandoned by God and the world. The organization where I work doesn't just offer food and shelter, but love. They see each refugee not as a burden or a threat, but as someone created in God's image, worthy of respect and care. There, I learned practical things, helping families navigate the asylum process, connecting people to medical care, and providing emotional support to those carrying deep trauma. At first, Ahmad was suspicious of my involvement with Christians. "You're getting too involved," he would say. "Don't forget where we come from. They are kind, but they are not our people." But over time, he saw the fruits that faith was bringing to my life. He saw that by helping others, I was finding healing. The turning point for Ahmad came when we met a family from our own region. The father had been imprisoned by ISIS for refusing to join them, and his wife and children had fled with nothing. They arrived in Germany devastated, full of fear and unable to trust anyone. Ahmad watched me sit with this family, listen to their stories, and help provide reassurance. The father asked me, "How can you have hope after everything you've seen?" I didn't preach or demand belief. I simply told my story, talked about Jesus, about the peace I found when I surrendered myself to Him, about the love that restored my lost identity. I offered to pray with them if they wanted. The man cried for the first time since they'd set foot in Germany. The family's faces began to smile. Ahmad saw it all and couldn't deny it. "There's something different about you," he told me later. "Something I can't explain," Ahmad once said. "You're the brother I knew as a child, only now you're stronger, more at peace." That night, for the first time since we fled, Ahmad asked me to pray with him. Not to Allah as we were taught, but to Jesus, the one who gave me hope. "I don't understand everything yet," he confessed, "but I want what you have. I want that peace." Ahmad's faith journey was different from mine. While I only encountered Jesus when I had already hit rock bottom, he came to faith by witnessing love in action. He saw how Christ's love worked through me and the organization where we work, and he wanted to be part of that transformation. Today we work side by side. Two brothers united not only by blood, but also by faith. Ahmad discovered a special talent for helping angry and vulnerable young people, those who could easily be drawn to extremist ideologies. He shares his story of how anger nearly destroyed him and how faith showed him a better path to channel his passion for justice. Together we learned that our suffering was not in vain. God used our pain to reach others, transforming our tragedy into a ministry of hope. The very experiences that nearly destroyed us became the foundation for helping others find healing and purpose. As I look back, I want to share some truths that might speak to you wherever you are in your own story. First, God's love transcends circumstances. When I knelt on that execution ground watching my brother face death, I felt abandoned by God. Today, I understand that He was with us even when I couldn't see it, working in the midst of chaos and preparing hearts I never imagined existed. The love that saved us did not depend on our perfection or our understanding. It depended on God's character. Second, faith can be born in the darkest places. My strongest moments of faith didn't happen in easy times. They were when I was at rock bottom, when I had nothing left to lean on but God's grace. If you're in a difficult place right now, don't give up. Sometimes God pushes us to the limit of our strength so we can discover the infinite depth of His love. Third, forgiveness is possible. I believed I could never forgive myself for my mistakes, my bad choices, or the people I couldn't save. But Jesus taught me that forgiveness isn't something we earn. It's something we receive. If you carry guilt or shame, know this: there is no weight so great that Christ cannot carry. I want to challenge you, who are listening to this. In your community, there may be refugees, immigrants, people who look different, who speak with strange accents. They carry difficult stories, deep pain. How about looking at them not with fear or distrust, but with an open heart? You can be their bridge to hope, just as someone was for me. These people are not threats to fear. They are lives to love. They are not burdens to avoid, but real opportunities to show the love of Christ. Don't judge someone by their appearance, their accent, or their background. When I infiltrated ISIS, I looked like a terrorist, but in reality, I was trying to save those I loved. The refugees who arrive in our communities may seem strange, even dangerous, but they are often victims of the same evil we flee. They need your love, your welcome, your concrete support. Remember, the first Christians were also refugees. Jesus, as a boy, was a refugee in Egypt fleeing persecution. The apostles were immigrants, bringing the gospel to foreign lands. The church has always been made up of people from different places, united by faith, not by nationality or skin color. Demonstrate Christ's love with actions, not just words. Offer real help, language lessons, professional training, sincere friendship. Open your home, your church, your heart. You can be the Christian family that changes someone's life forever, just as one family changed ours. As I finish telling our story, I want you to know that I'm not here to portray myself as a hero. I failed, I made mistakes, and I carry scars that still haunt me. Even so, I chose the difficult path when other shortcuts seemed easier. I share this to show that God can use anyone, any situation. He can bring light even from the deepest darkness. I am deeply grateful that we survived, Ahmad and I. I'm grateful for the Christian family who planted faith in our hearts. I am grateful for the refugees who confide their stories in me. I am grateful for the chance to serve others who walk the same hard path we did. My hope is that more people discover what we have discovered, that Jesus is real, that His love transforms lives, that faith can give meaning even to the most painful moments. May the church continue to be a refuge for those who have nowhere else to turn. If you're watching and don't yet know Jesus, I invite you to get to know Him, not as a distant figure, but as someone who understands your pain, who offers true hope, and who died to give you life. The same Jesus who met me in my darkest hour wants to meet you in yours. If you're already a follower of Jesus, I want to challenge you to live your faith in a practical way. Seek out refugees, immigrants, and those excluded from your community. See them as people to love, not as problems to solve. Your kindness can be the first step towards someone knowing God's love. And if you carry the pain of the past, know that this is not your final story. God can use your worst experiences to bless others. He can transform your tragedy into hope. The same grace that saved Ahmad and me is available to you. Before I close, I ask you to do something that can change lives. Share this story with at least 10 people. Friends, family, people in your church or community who need to hear about hope, faith, and the power of love to overcome hate. Share it on social media, send it via text, or show it to your church or group. You never know who's struggling with despair, who's questioning God's love, who needs to hear that the worst moment doesn't have to be the end. And please comment here where you're watching from. We want to know if this message is reaching hearts around the world, if hope is reaching every corner. Most importantly, you will survive. Just as Ahmad and I have survived so many losses, rejections, threats, and traumas, you too can overcome what you're facing. God has a plan for you, a purpose for your pain, and a future full of hope. Share this story. Tell us where you're watching from. And always remember, you are not alone. You have not been forgotten, and you will prevail. God's love is stronger than any circumstance, and His grace is sufficient for every need. Thank you for listening to our story. May God bless you and give you hope.